Hello, beautiful community. Hello, beautiful community. Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me. We're trying a new mic setup, and that's risky. And because it's risky, we got to see if we are able to hear each other. Because I'm using this mic that is boringly possessed by all the YouTubers, the Shure SM7B, which I only use for non-lives, but I've stuck it into my computer now because the other mic was giving us so many problems. So if you can hear me, that is truly fantastic. Yes, Vlad is back live. Good evening. So let me just touch on a couple of questions that are already there. And then I might tell you a little bit about me or the world, then I'll take a few more of your questions. I've set up you can only write a comment every 60 seconds mode. Do you hate it? Is it tidier? Let me know. RSH 696 is asking, having said something very beautiful about well wishes for me. I'm grateful for your gesture. But RSH says, I'm very disturbed by the lionization of Mr. Mangione in the US right now. Does this reaction make political violence in the US more likely, or am I overreacting? Now, I've turned off ads for this, but there's still a risk on YouTube about talking such things. So let me just say something in generalities. Violence is the politics of enemies, and the politics of enemies is the enemy of democracy. And that means that you can't, when you condemn it, add a but at the end. But that doesn't mean that you can never add a but. It just means that you can't add a but in the same line of speech, especially if you're a political actor. That's unconstructive, because you just have to say an unconditional no to political violence. Having said this, of course, there is a distinction about what you can say in private and what you can say in public about events of such kind. Let me just give you a hypothetical illustration that's nothing to do with this particular case. Imagine that I am publishing a magazine alongside my YouTube activities, and in the magazine, I have published a few remarks and cartoons that are particularly offensive to a particular religion. And imagine that completely unjustifiable violent acts occur afterwards. Now, in private, we could have a conversation about whether what I've put down in my magazine, given that it was offensive and disgusting, let's assume that it was, doesn't mean that the violence is remotely justified, but it means that I'm somehow part of the story of what happened afterwards. I'm somehow part of the story. So saying that in public is really difficult, and saying that about if you're a politician is really difficult. So that's always a distinction you've got to keep in mind. But I've got to say, even in private, I'm in favor of pretty unconditional condemnation of all political violence. So that's the first block of it. The second block of it consists of two bits. One is the fact that in an extraordinarily wealthy country, people are made to bear the consequences of things that happen to them that aren't their fault, things that happen to their bodies. I mean, the situation with access to healthcare in the United States is extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. Not that we can sing in Europe, especially in Britain. So that's one thing. There's a real element of injustice and exclusion there, right, from participation in the resources society has available to it, should have available to everyone. And then there's another element, and that's that crisis of trust, that wanting to give up on institutions is not just something that applies to certain demographics. It's ubiquitous now. Now, you and I often talk about it in terms of the post-truth populist right giving up on institutions. But I think it's ubiquitous. Giving up on institutions, giving up on due process, feeling that the system is broken, feeling that the system is rigged. All of these sentiments are now ubiquitous. So that's as a general response. We might get into it more depending on whether people have questions. Another question from Ryan Woods. In a similar vein, my family voted for reform in the UK in the last election, which is a party that I label post-truth populist right. But they voted for Remain in 2016. They voted to stay in the European Union. Why are people so naive to think that a bloke holding a pint of beer can solve all the country's problems? Well, they weren't that naive in 2016. I mean, what's fascinating about Brexit is that even if you were a rational Brexiteer, what was apparent was that the gang of demagogues, populists, and post-truth populists who were advocating Brexit were never capable of delivering anything serious. So even if you thought that direction was good, it was being offered by a gang of folks who could never be taken seriously. And your family got that. But I think we're seeing a very big slide. I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating, and that's one of the reasons that I've been saying for 2 years that I felt on balance Trump was favorite, is that people who voted center-left or voted for quasi-neoliberal technocratic centrism or whatever, or center-right, responsible conservatism, from all of these groups, people are leaking badly into just giving up on the whole show. And that even includes clearly your family, right, who've gone from Remain to Reform. The only piece of advice I have is that we're on a long journey, not just with our democracies, but with everybody in our lives, politically, right? So don't make sort of your sense of where your family is at on this overly definite. They could evolve again, right? That could fall out of love with Farage in 3 or 4 years. So, understand that in some ways, the current moments of blowing through our politics are inspiring certain things to come out of people and not inspiring other things to come out of people. But these things that aren't inspired to come out are still potentially there. And so we've got to very much sort of not give up on each other politically, and be open to the fact that we change and we evolve. And then in a certain sense, it's not even about change. It's about bringing out what's already there, but it's dormant. So that's all I would say. But I do think that in some ways they're on the right side of history, because when I talk about that gap of legitimacy between populations and governments, which you have in France and Britain and the United States, in this country, in the UK, Reform is probably the party today that is doing more to break that crisis of legitimacy and address people's real concerns in a very exploitative and deceptive and destructive way, but they're doing it. And the big problem is that nobody's doing the equivalent of that connecting up, but in a responsible way. And that's the job of Labour. That's the job of the Conservative Party. That's the job of the Liberal Democrats. That's the job of the Green Party. All of these other parties can do much better. And until they do, quite frankly, it's partly, you know, a matter that can be criticized, your family's support for reform, but it's partly a matter that's about us criticizing the other parties who have lost people who've gone to reform for reasons that are about practicing politics in a way that's not good enough. Now, I've been raving on like a lunatic, so let's have a look. Rachel, you're asking me about Wes Streeting and the UK government and ME. There is no prospect at the moment of any meaningful progress on ME with this Labour government. And quite frankly, this is a government that is, if we're to generalize about it, playing a very defensive game and is trending toward being almost center right on economics. Um, uh, and that combined with a very defensive stance, not articulating a vision for the country at all, means that they're not very likely to get to the challenging and sort of dormant issues like ME, why there are 300,000 plus folks in the UK who are very sick and not being given access to any helpful medical care. They're not likely to get to that, given other things they're not getting to, I'm afraid. But we always keep up the fight. Let's have a look. No. Just gonna make sure the sound is still working. It's still working. So I did put Trump and Putin and peace and war in the title. Doesn't mean we have to talk about it. RSH, thank you for thanking me for the answer. David Elston is saying, how partisan is the emerging oligarchy of US tech bros? So there is a big drift among that demographic toward Trump. But what worries me really is what's their stance going to be on even worse than Trump politicians in the 2030s. And so one of my pessimistic predictions, as somebody who in a tongue-in-cheek way predicts that Musk and Trump will fall out, is that Musk will get further radicalized and will find Trump's destructive populism not radical enough and will be open to supporting even more destructive political candidates in the 2030s. But what you want to do with that demographic is make sure that they're not all behind a very ugly kind of politics in the 2030s. And that means not mocking them, but engaging with them, right? And that involves Musk too. Win him back. If you're the Democrats, win Musk back. Luke is asking me if violence can ever be just. Yes, of course. I mean, let's take an example. Ukraine is defending itself. It has to engage in violence to defend itself against an outrageous Russian aggression. Right? Vlad Romaniuk is saying, do I have any further thoughts about Trump's official picks? Well, we need to see how many of them get through. But at the moment, it's an ill-assorted mix about which it's premature to make judgments, right? I mean, even on foreign policy, you've got a couple of camps already developing. You've got one camp that says isolationism, period. And you've got another camp which says hawkishness on China. Now, neither of these two camps actually center Russia, Ukraine, but they are quite different camps. And so we need to see how this develops. And then there are two elements to Trump psychology there. One is an FU psychology, an FU to the system. And the other is, um, about creating a preemptive sort of circus that's about centering for others, but also for himself, the idea that he won't be as co-opted in the second term as he was in the first term. But also, it's worth saying these picks are not very ideological. Trump is not going to cry if he, doesn't get a whole bunch of them. Clears is asking, do I think Putin would hand over Assad to keep Russia's base in Syria? I don't think he will face that question. Under what circumstances could he face that question? But he certainly will try to stay on reasonable terms with whatever is forming in terms of that constellation of forces and groups taking charge in Syria. And one of the funny things was the way Russian propaganda progressed on the day of the revolution. They started off talking about the rebels as terrorists. Then they were talking about them in neutral groups, in neutral terms. Then they were talking about them in nearly positive terms. And then they reported positively on the change of flag in the Syrian embassy in Moscow. So within a few hours, the position of Russian propaganda evolved on this. Tammy, thank you so much for asking that question about what to do if listening to Putin makes you feel ill. And I mean, it's not a joke because, of course, you might think, well, it is a joke because why would one listen to something that makes one feel sick? But I think it's true about a lot of politics. They're making us feel sick at the moment. And I always say, put mental health first and put sustainability first, and be aware that you're putting stuff into your body, right? And that really matters. So if you're going to listen to something because you're just too curious not to, then don't do it just before you fall asleep, that kind of thing. Self-protection is more important than being informed, because if you try to get informed by contravening your needs for self-protection, you won't be informed in the long term, right? You won't sustain the kind of diet you're putting yourself in for. So I think it's that's really important. And then also with stuff like Putin, the resources that I offer on the two channels for summing up what he comes up with are more than enough to keep touch. Amado is asking about the unidentified flying objects, I think, in New Jersey and elsewhere. The only thing I would say about it is that friend of the channel's Ryan Macbeth tried his hand at a little breakdown of it. But for me, what always concerns me in cases like this is trust and under communication. I do not like when people are asking, what is going on? What is going on? And there is an under communication from some, but not all, agencies of state. Awakening Richard is asking, where is Vlad from? I was born in Soviet Russia, but I left before the Soviet Union collapsed for Israel. And then in about 1994, I came from Israel to the UK. And I've lived in a couple of other countries since then, but I've been more or less in the West, basically, for all that time. Dima is asking, is there anything Russians within Russia can do? No, until certain things change, and we always talk about what they might be, but that is the perception that there is an actionable alternative tied to a crack in the regime, an articulation of an alternative political vision, and that vision articulated by some kind of political actor who takes a kind of leadership position. So one of the distinctive things about the Prigozhin mutiny was that there was no articulation of an alternative position. I understand that being pessimistic, D is asking, isn't sexy or masculine, but at what point does optimism turn into an empty gesture? AI, democracy is crumbling, climate change, Trump, etc. So I'm optimistic, and I'm also very pessimistic. Now, I am pessimistic relative to all the people who think that our democracy is going through some ups and downs. I am pessimistic relative to people who think that the climate crisis isn't a big deal, because I think it's a huge deal. I am pessimistic relative to people who think that the West will get its act together and reform an international order. But fundamentally, I'm optimistic about where we're going politically. But that's because I think that on an historical scale, we're moving from a very good situation to a good situation, and from a good situation to a good situation minus. Let's look at my realistic worst case scenario for the 2030s. The international order has collapsed. There's much less of a capacity to act coherently against tyrants like Putin in the 2030s. And the climate crisis is much worse. And 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 Western democracies have collapsed. Now, that's not a nightmarish scenario for me relative to human history. It is a nightmarish scenario relative to the Fukuyamian age of the 1990s. By that standard, it's a disaster. It's a sort of a refutation of everything we stand for by the world. But by my standards, historical standards, which incorporate an understanding of unbelievable plagues and wars and civil wars and so on for centuries, this is a relatively good situation. There'll be people going to museums and galleries and enjoying in 2037 in the West, even in the countries where democracy has collapsed, because they're not going to be Syria, these countries, they're going to be Hungary. When democracy collapses in Britain in 2040, as it's unlikely to do, but it could, we're not going to be Syria, we're going to be Hungary. And in Hungary, people go to hear the Budapest Festival Orchestra conducted by Ivan Fischer, one of the 2 greatest living conductors. So you see what I mean? This is relative to expectation. That if you start looking at human history with, Thucydides and then crawl toward our own historical period across 2000 plus years, you'll see that stuff gets really, really dicey. And there is massive collective tragedy and calamity. So by my standards, what most people in our conversation are freaking out about is really terrible. if we have a short-term historical memory. But it's far from being the worst if we have a long-term a long-term historical memory. So that's part of the sources for my optimism. Another fundamental source for my optimism is that my optimism is about this. Can we tell a truthful story about the situation we're in, not BS ourselves, and still feel that that story is hopeful? And I believe that we can. So, and we can make some progress, right? We can engage in activities of democratic regeneration. Even when we talk about Trump making a deal to stop the war, that can go better or worse. And millions of lives will be affected for the worse or for the better. And that's not set in stone. That could go either way. So that's some of why, it's important for us to not become sort of historically amnesia ridden snowflakes. Sorry. But when we are snowflakes, it's no good to tell each other off and say, stop being snowflakes. No, if I'm a snowflake, that means I'm struggling with something. So you're not going to help me by telling me I should stop being a snowflake. You should empathize with me and give me the possibility to maybe see things in a slightly different light and explore. That's important. So I don't like this sort of culturally conservative telling off of people for just needing to stop being snowflakes. D, thank you for asking the question. Father William is asking, instead of telling a truthful story, why not just look for the truth? A story is just something to make you feel better. Reality should concern us, not stories. No. We can't make sense of reality except through certain narratives about it. And these narratives are not reducible to matters of fact. What you make, let's say, of the Russo-Ukrainian war, in part depends on your sense of history. In part, it depends on your values. In part, it depends on how you understand the relationships of states with one another. In part, it depends on what you see to be the possibilities of a new world order forming as an older one is crumbling. And so all of that isn't something about which you can state the truth. It's stuff you can talk about. This is not a postmodernist answer. I'm not giving you a truth is relative answer. I'm saying that all of that requires robustly truthful exploration, but there is no such thing as the truth about that we can discover. And once discovered, we can blast others into accepting it. We're talking about making sense, which depends on interpretation, or as philosophers might say, hermeneutics. So there is no such thing as looking for the truth and arriving at the truth about the Russo-Ukrainian war. There is such a thing as engaging with it in a truthful way, right? And that means two things, right? Trying to get the world right, accuracy, and also trying to be honest with yourself, not BSing. And that's why I tend to always favor the word truthful over the word truth, telling the truth. Because especially in our scientific culture, we often risk thinking that the only things that are true are facts. And I don't think that's the case. I think that um, narratives can be more or less truthful, more or less suspicious, right? But you can't present a narrative, even if it's a very compelling one, and say that's the truth. Suzanne, hi to you, and you're in Serbia. Daniel is asking me about Romania. Well, Romania has faced a constitutional crisis because it's been washed over by forces of right populism that are washing across the entire West with a spice of malign foreign interference from the Russians. When democracies that have enough institutional pluralism have constitutional crises, it can be a sign of strength that they can come through crises like that, or it can be a sign of weakness if they crumble through these crises. But these are very, very difficult waters. Um, Waters of fundamental contestation where there are different sides saying, no, 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 this is legitimate, and the other side saying, no, 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 it's not legitimate. This is extremely painful for democratic process. But it's a wave that's washing across all of us. Climate change. Rachel is asking, am I worried about my friends in Tonga? Look, I'm worried about all low-level island nations, and Tonga is particularly prone to cyclones and extreme weather events and tsunamis. But as are a lot of the islands. So yeah, I'm absolutely concerned there are some countries in the world that may not be there in 2100. Kalina is saying there isn't a constitutional crisis in Romania. Well, I would say that's what a constitutional crisis looks like, but you may have a different view. A constitutional crisis is basically when there is a fundamental conflict in a democracy about whether to accept not the result of a certain process, but whether to accept the process itself. When there's fundamental contestation about that, right? So there would have been, for example, a constitutional crisis in the United States had Trump lost, because Trump voters would have said, we don't want to accept the results of this election, right? That would have been a constitutional crisis of a kind for me. Constitutional crisis in this sense is when you're losing civic support for the idea that no matter how much you disagree about the result, you accept the process that generated it. When you lose support for the process that generated the result, that's one way to have what I call a constitutional crisis. That doesn't require institutions collapsing. Jackson, is there any political action to be taken about public intellectuals, users being taken over by the algorithm? Some sort of law to encourage transparency in how these algorithms work? So I do think that one of the things that you all would feel is that folks are swimming about on this platform in a very unbounded way. You get to kind of do what you want unless you specifically say things that Google doesn't want you to say. But unless you do that, you pretty much can say what you want. And it's difficult because it requires people to self-manage. But people get very delusional very quickly when there are certain kinds of punishments and rewards, right? So if I sit here and I'm starting a YouTube channel and, I want to talk about, I don't know, Russia. I make 5 videos about how Russia's about to collapse. They do well. I make 5 videos about how Russia is actually fairly stable and disappointingly ready to perpetuate the war into 2026, and its economy isn't going to collapse. These videos do a lot less well. They do 7 times less well. What happens to me, not in every case, right? There are people to whom it doesn't happen, but what happens to 99% of people in that situation is not that they begin to just trick themselves and their viewers into, the Russia's collapsing story. It's that they begin to believe in it themselves because it's convenient. And it's very painful to have a lack of congruence between what you feel and what you think and what you say. And so there's kind of a merger that happens. And eventually it begins, well, maybe it is collapsing a little bit. Well, it's collapsing a bit, maybe a bit more than a bit, maybe, and then you get there, right? And the difference is that, it's not just that you're rewarded by views. It's that you're also avoiding the pain of YouTube giving you 7 pages of analytics with all these gray arrows pointing down saying, here is why your audience doesn't want to listen to you. Here is why they turn off. Here is why they don't click. Nobody's interested in this, right? I regularly make videos where the arrows are very, very bad. They're looking very low. And quite frankly, if I were a sensitive 21-year-old, I'd have a mental health issue around it. But now I'd like to see how these people do in the long term. I think that you could do well in the long term. You could just keep adjusting to the algorithm, I suppose. But that's the problem. What do we do about it is your question. I think it's difficult to know what to do about it, except by talking about some kind of democratic oversight over these social media platforms. And one of the kinds of oversight is to have oversight over the algorithms. That's to say, a capacity to have some kind of public body look into the algorithms and then make requests about features of algorithms that are unacceptable. This is very difficult because it's a kind of international project. But I do think that what we've currently got on this platform, and this is probably the best platform, one of the very best, maybe the best platform, is not quite sustainable. It's not, democracy does not last when the state of social media is what it is today. So we certainly need some kind of democratic oversight. And we also need to have a little bit of a cultural reckoning with it. Now, I wouldn't be too optimistic about that making a huge difference, but we do need a cultural reckoning. And part of what I say, like a broken record, is that what worries me so much isn't what you think, but how you think it. Just go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I'm not worried at all, if you've sat down and you've read some economic analysis and you believe Russia's economy is about to collapse. I have no problem with that. If it's well reasoned, I'm in love with that. What I have a problem with is if you say 4 or 5 catchphrases about the collapsing Russian economy that shows that they've been caused not by your reflection on the issue, but by just imbibing algorithmic currents. That's to say, imbibing a situation where people are telling you what you want to hear and then receiving back from you a sense of what you want to hear and telling you even more of what you want to hear. And then you come to want to hear that even more, having been told it even more. And then that's imbibed by the. So there's this kind of a vicious cycle whereby there's a process of mutual reinforcement between audience and content creator. That's what I mind. I never mind a particular view, even if I think it's not a view that I recommend or it's mine or is well supported. I'd much rather that, right, that you come at it, by freely thinking about it, than by you sharing a view that I do recommend if you've come to share it algorithmically, right? So I think that's important, right? And a kind of cultural reckoning with it matters. And the problem I have is that a lot of the people who are offering a cultural reckoning with it are themselves caught up by algorithms. So this is difficult. And we'll keep talking about it, we'll keep exploring. But I think there is both a cultural reckoning dimension here and a democratic oversight over the internet dimension here. Because quite frankly, the state of social media today is not compatible with avoiding the kind of cultural dis-ease that leads to trust obliterating polarization and alienation. Gen Consensus is saying we're 700. Well, do you know how difficult it is to get 10,000 to watch live simultaneously? You probably need to have 1 million to 2 million subs for that. We're a small concert venue. Vinkas is asking me, how do I feel about the future of the Baltic states if Ukraine would fall as Lithuania next? So I remain an alarmist about the Baltic states up to a point. And I am less of an alarmist than I was before the Ukraine war, full-scale war. And indeed, there is a video on the main channel from about 2020 or so, before I was regularly sharing, where I talk not about being worried about Ukraine being invaded, but being worried about one of the Baltic states getting not invaded, but having some kind of provocation, Russian provocation occur there that may or may not trigger Article 5, sort of in clownish terms, taking a village in Estonia. The details don't matter. But yes, I think that historical forces are likely to blow us past it, but I still think that the default, and this is where I slightly disagree with Mark Galeotti, but I think the default of the Putin regime is to end up challenging Article 5 in some way. But their concept of that would be to not challenge it until they feel that it could be challenged unanswered. So the conversation we're really having, and maybe that is worth a main channel video in of itself, is that in my analysis, Article 5 has already collapsed to some degree. And that's, if nothing else, just a sociological observation. In 2015, if you take sort of samples of opinion in global power corridors outside of the West about Article 5, they think, yeah, it's there, it's going to work. Now people's answer is maybe it will, maybe it won't. Who knows? Who knows? So that's part of the disintegration of the global order, that there is now less trust that Article 5 works globally. Now, you might actually argue it's more likely to work than the degree of distrust in it suggests. But that's also kind of worry, right? Because what you don't want is a situation where the Russians get this wildly wrong and think that they're not going to get a response by doing something when in fact they will. And so basically the answer is that probably history will blow us past Russia challenging Article 5, but the trend is for them to drift in that direction. And it's just because historical winds will blow things off course that we won't get there. But I think that the odds of Russia challenging Article 5 are over 10%, between 10 and 50% in my view. So that's significant. Now, one of the things to say about Mark Galeotti's different perspective is that Mark thinks that Putin is doing foreign escalation out of regime security needs, but that Putin can be content with continuing escalation. Escalation doesn't have to take the form of war. I tend to not be sure of that. I tend to think that it's war. Now, Benedict Allen is asking 10 to 50% why so high. Well, I actually think the trajectory is for the Putin regime to challenge Article 5. That's my interpretation. But because history is unpredictable, lots of things can happen in Russia too that can blow us past that reality. So it's something that we're on track for, but history tends to never land us where we are on track to get to. So I would say that there's a sort of let's say a 70% chance we won't get there. It's an absolutely serious conversation. There is a school of thought about this which says no, it's not going to happen. It can't happen because the Russians understand that NATO is the United States effectively, and you don't challenge the United States. And I say Russians might understand that NATO is the United States, but they think the United States is weakening. And it's precisely because NATO is the United States and the United States is weakening that you can challenge it. So don't take my view of that, but that's the interpretation I recommend. As I say, it's not a strong interpretation in the sense that I'm not as committed to that as I am to some other observation about, let's say, democratic decline. But in terms of a psychological placeholder, I think that the chances of that are certainly double figure significant. If in the end it's still true that we're likely to slide past it without it happening. Steffs is saying, is Russia in risk of the separation of regions? Whatever happened to those places separate? So there are many disanalogies between the breakup of the Soviet Union and possible speculation about the breakup of Russia. There is a video on that. I think it's one of my best videos on the main channel called Will Russia Break Up, where I do two interesting things that almost go in opposite directions. I say, on the one hand, that all the conventional arguments for Russia breaking up that you hear today are actually weak, but that I am still an alarmist about Russia breaking up despite the weakness of these arguments, that it'll break up despite these arguments, possibly, rather than because of them. So I think that there are many structural factors mitigating against Russia breaking up that are often underestimated. But I do think that risk is there, and if we reduce the bar here to just talking about a few regions peeling off, then that becomes, even more plausible, if not indeed even likely. So there we go. There's nothing I can say probably that'll be as cumulatively useful as what I've said in that video. I think it's certainly not a short-term risk, but I do think it's a risk worth taking seriously, as well as also thinking there's a lot of trashy activist conversations in this realm which don't really take account of the agency involved and how Russia works, how the regions work. They don't take account of the ethnic constitution of Russia. So, for instance, there's a lot of trashy activism about the liberation of ethnic minorities in regions where the ethnic minorities are a tiny minority themselves. A lot of Russia's ethnic regions are still either majority Russian ethnically, or are regions where no single group is a majority. So there's lots of really sort of kitschy Twitter activism happening around this. Because if you turned up on the doorstep now, the overwhelming majority of even the ethnic minorities in Russia will say, I don't want Russia to break up. So can I remove this untouchable thing who's going on about Chelsea? Have I missed something? What should Europe do to become more resilient against hybrid warfare? This is so difficult because there's this risk that the more we are alert to the malign forms of manipulation and interference of our democracies, the more we get hysterical about that and forget the domestic causes of our division. And we start blaming everything. We start blaming everything on malign foreign interference. So it's a very difficult risk. So we have to be extremely sober about how the Russians and the Chinese are interfering without dramatizing it. So that's something that's always a very, very big concern for me, right? Blowing up Russian interference from being a 0.5% influence to talking about it as though it's a 50% influence in the outcomes of elections, let's say. It could be 50, but then you have to prove that. And if you have proved it, not via some kind of conspiracy theory arguments, but if you've really proved it, then you have to stand up and say, I'm sorry, this democratic process actually wasn't democratic because we've observed this vast interference, so we have to do something about it. So when it's genuinely provably there and the scale is provable, then you can take a strong stand. But otherwise, you really shouldn't. I don't like people going around. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I don't even know if Chelsea are playing tonight. So, but that person got removed or deleted. So that's one thing to concern us. But the other thing that is really important, unfortunately, is so banal, is that we have to learn to talk to each other properly. And we have to depolarize ourselves, and we have to be able to speak freely to each other without repressing what we want to say just because the other side finds it offensive or disagreeable or intolerable. Because it's only if we can talk to each other properly, if we can share the table of politics properly, that we can jointly discuss issues of malign foreign interference. Because unless we can talk to each other properly, we will always blame foreign interference on why the other side aren't persuaded by us, or are going up against us, or are being mean to us, or are playing the breaking the rules of the democratic game to beat us. I will always be blaming foreign interference for the action of our political opponents, and thereby casting our political opponents as political enemies. So this is the most porridgey, sentimental answer I'm giving you, but it's the truth. That's to say, the healthier our democratic discourse at home, the more resilient we are to this. The more divided we are into bubbles of mental and fact worlds, the more impossible it'll be for us to even talk about foreign interference, right? And that's the risk at the moment. That's the risk at the moment. There we go. That's the risk at the moment, that we can't even discuss these issues properly because Barry and Sally agree that it's happening, but Patrick and Samantha think is just made up, and they can't share in a common picture of what's going on with each other. So we've got to find a way of talking to each other better. And unless we do, there's just no possibility of us meaningfully responding to the mounting threats of foreign interference. Because notice what I said earlier about how I felt that the Russians were dependent on war and not just escalation. That's an interpretation. But when they say they're dependent on war, that's not instead of, that's as well as other forms of escalation, short of war, right? They're going to continue. So sometimes a porridgey sentimental answer is where we need to start if it's the truth. If Putin challenges Article 5, where do you expect the war in Ukraine to be? Will Russia still be fighting a full-scale war in Ukraine, in your analysis? Well, I don't have an analysis of the details of any of this. It's just a hypothetical conversation of what may or may not happen. I think that it is likely that the Kremlin for years to come will retain a project of gaining political control over Ukraine. Then it'll be up to us whether we accommodate them in that or not. And it'll be about the details of what kind of provocation against Article 5 in somewhere in Scandinavia or somewhere in the Baltics they can come up with. And some of that is a matter of military detail, which I can't comment on. And certainly my view is absolutely compatible with the fact that they might want to challenge Article 5, but on a particular occasion find that there's no militarily viable way of doing so. That's also possible. So I'm really talking about a kind of a default trajectory that then needs to be percolated through a military expertise I deliberately stay out of. But yeah, a plausible picture is that the Ukraine war is in some kind of stasis. It's frozen in some way. And it's possible for Putin to find a way of doing something that makes the West ask the question, has Article 5 been challenged here or not? So some kind of a border case, right? That's on the one hand enough to make some people in the West feel that this is an Article 5 challenge, and then enough to make some people also feel that Article 5 has been challenged and nothing has been done about it. And so if Article 5 is challenged, if Article 5 is challenged by the Russians and we don't respond, that's effectively the end of NATO, right? There is a video about this on the main channel. There is also a perspective from Mark Galeotti about this on the main channel, where I deliberately sort of ask Mark some questions and platform his view because it's a little bit less alarmist than mine. Matthias is saying, is Kadyrov in danger of outliving his usefulness, becoming too much of a nuisance without a strong enough power base? No. Kadyrov's power has been increasing. And in recent months, Kadyrov has even taken sides in a business dispute in Russia in a way that contravened the side that Putin took, right? Kadyrov pushed against a business deal that was pre-approved by Putin. So it's a complex relationship of mutual dependence. You always have to watch Kadyrov's health. That looks more stable at the moment. And realize that if that's the trajectory, then Kadyrov will be planning to outlive Putin and somehow, planning for that kind of future. Now, what Kadyrov is doing now is he is making gambits to appeal to immigrants in Russia. He's making gambits to appeal to all citizens in the Caucasus, and he's making gambits to appeal to the large Muslim population in Russia. These are not gambits for leadership of the country, but they are gambits that indicate that Kadyrov is able to take advantage of a very significant kind of dependence that the Kremlin has on him. The Kremlin, of course, it works the other way around too, of course. So Kadyrov is dependent on the Kremlin. If there is a change either in Chechnya or in Moscow, that will significantly destabilize the other party, the other side. Without Kadyrov, Putin is destabilized, and without Putin, Kadyrov is profoundly destabilized. Peter is saying Kadyrov wants to take over Russia. So if you take somebody like Lukashenko, and if Russia just ate up Belarus and literally made it part of Russia, somebody like Lukashenko would want to compete for political power on the Russian space. Kadyrov isn't that. Kadyrov knows it's not realistically possible for him to be leader of Russia, nor does he really desire that. So he has regional ambitions. Benedict is asking, is religious conservatism anti-enlightenment? Well, there's a wonderful book, I think, by Marc Julian called The Autocritique of Enlightenment. Enlightenment is very many different things, and enlightenment offers some of the most extraordinary critiques of enlightenment that are available in our culture. I kind of find part of enlightenment too. So self-critique is a part of enlightenment. So it's easy for us to make these sort of cartoonish generalizations about enlightenment and anti-enlightenment, but sometimes it's good to go slow. But certainly, religious faith can be a profoundly thoughtful position, and conservatism can be a profoundly thoughtful position. So unless you're talking about a kind of religious conservatism that is incompatible with basic democratic values like equality before the law and so on, and equal rights, then it's entirely compatible with what we might too loosely call the Enlightenment project. Julia is asking me, how free are the people in the USA compared to the people in Sweden? It's my professional expertise, conceptions of liberty in the West, so it'll be ridiculous for me to try to say something about it. What I would say is that, you can't just compare freedom, obviously, by comparing possibilities for action. You need to talk about the availability of somehow worthwhile possibilities, right? Otherwise, you'll end up thinking that, Albania in 1970 was freer than Britain because its road system was so much poorer that there were many few restrictions on action when you were on the road. And that's ridiculous, right? You're not freer just because there are no traffic lights. So we need to talk about worthwhile possibilities, and most importantly, what may end up happening, Julia, is that our conversation becomes not about freedom but about other values. In other words, we might cast the differences between Sweden and the United States in terms of what other values, like forms of equality, for example, are more entrenched in one place rather than another. So we'll be talking about conflicts of values there inevitably, and we'll be talking about more than one value if we're going to capture the difference between USA and Sweden. And then we'll also be talking about different conceptions of freedom. Freedom is not a thing that comes in a kind of block. There are 11 conceptions of freedom freely floating around in the West. And we'll find out that Sweden expresses some of them better, and the USA expresses others better. Now, you know where I stand on certain issues, like the issue we started with at the beginning about, access to basic public goods like healthcare. I think the United States is in many ways in a kind of calamitous and unserious place when it comes to that kind of access and provision. I don't have. It's today is asking, do I have anything to say about Trump talking about Canada becoming another state in the United States in jest? It's a kind of speech that populist discourse delivers, kitchen table talk. Obama couldn't say that except in a much, much more sort of comical, tongue-in-cheek way, much more overtly comical and tongue-in-cheek. Trump can, and populist discourse will continue giving us politicians who can increasingly speak like that, who can increasingly say things like, well, why don't we just invade our neighbor? So that's going to happen more, not less. But no, I don't think there's anything interesting or serious about Trump's particular remark, except as an expression of the drift of kitchen table discourse in politics. Just browsing comments. Is this mode worse or better where there's a 60-second break before you can post a second comment? Faust is asking, how's your health? Hope you're feeling all right. Health's terrible. So this is a sort of a gargantuan effort of finding a moment, but otherwise I'm in quite a violent place where I'm struggling to breathe for several hours a day and have really, sort of extreme symptoms that I'm still not able to get under control with the drug protocol that I'm on. So I'm in a stormy ocean 80% of the time without a paddle. But there are moments where I can, be drifted onto the beach, and when they happen, I work because I love that. So yeah, I was sort of prepping to be vertical for this for about 10 hours with being in an oxygen machine, taking lots of meds, and so on. And then I'll be crashing from this for a day at the moment. So it was already a miracle how much I was doing before what happened to me since August. But this has been a sort of a real sea change. It's a completely different reality for me at the moment. So everything is a challenge in the sense of you think, oh, how is that even going to be possible? And you have to find some way of getting through it. Luke, you're asking about the reasons for democratic decline. I think that there are two. There are two things I always say. I talk about the four forms of distrust and the four social forces that are causing it. And because I repeat that so often, I won't impose that on the audience today. But it is there in all my videos. It's in the Russian propaganda video from a few months ago in the main channel. And what I do promise is a separate main channel video sometime on democratic decline. Vertifiel, thank you for saying I'm lucid and insightful. I mean, I'm lucky, and this is really not more than luck, that my mental health is amazing. When I face physical health challenges, I don't want to say that's some kind of great achievement. It's luck, primarily because you can get some kind of, I don't know, bizarre, I don't know, stomach parasite that goes to your head and immediately changes your brain chemistry. Something that happened to me a couple of years ago was quite an amazing ride. And so you're not, I don't want to overstate this. This is just sheer luck that I don't have any depressed thoughts, and that I'm very external, as you can see, right? I'm out at sea without a paddle, but even in this conversation, you can see that I'm giving more than I'm taking. I don't mean in terms of ideas, I mean in terms of energy. I'm not here to grab your energy, I'm giving energy. Which is also difficult when you're sick, because a lot of the time that requires some physical, bubbliness, and sometimes that's impossible. Yeah, so it's but what I'm saying is kind of ludicrous, because nobody seeing me now can believe what I've described as true of 90% of my time. Because you only believe what you see. And that's partly why I document a little bit of the dark moments that are more sort of frequently representative of my time on the ME Diary channel. But even now, what I'm doing reminds me of Chris Hitchens when he wrote in his last book, which sort of peters out as he loses his life, of going on talk shows and doing events while feeling unbelievably horrific, but just trying to appear normal. A lot of what I'm doing is that. And also, I'm secretly lying down right now. It looks like I'm sitting up, but I'm basically mostly horizontal. So, great. Okay, enough about my health for now. With the corner of my eye, I spotted the name Dugin in the comments. Let me see if I can fish it out. Dugin is a certain kind of intensification of Putinist ideology. That's why I don't think he's just a crank who doesn't matter. And no, I didn't watch his debate with John Mearsheimer. The requests are piling up in my inboxes for me to watch it, but I haven't watched it. They debated for 3 hours. Oh, does the Dugin Mearsheimer debate have anything interesting in it? I don't know. I think that I might not watch it, because I can tell you exactly what Mearsheimer will say and what Dugin would say. So I can do the debate now for 3 hours. Go fast now. Helpful wishes to your invisible disability. Luke, thank you back. Yeah, I mean, the problem with that request was it's a 3-hour debate that Dugin and Mearsheimer did. Lukashenko is much more, Matthias is asking, is he a believer in Russian? Well, he's much more of an opportunist than Putin. Much more of an opportunist. And he has a certain kind of disdain for Putin's earnest ideological seriousness. Lukashenko is much more a self-aggrandizing narcissist. And I mean that, diagnostically, he would pass with colors any and narcissistic personality disorder scale. Putin wouldn't. Putin is extraordinarily psychologically corrupted by power, and that's something we often don't understand when we talk about these tyrants, how corrupted by power they are. I mean, we talked about people being sort of mildly corrupted by algorithms. Times that by a million, how you are corrupted with power, how you're corrupted by unconstrained power. The rigidity of Putin's takes on the world is terrifying. His inflexibility in how he sees the world is fanatical in a way that is just unreachable for us. It's extraordinary, that level of disfigurement that powers had on him. Um, so it's pretty scary how he thinks. And it's pretty scary how sincere Putin is about all his mystical stuff. And Lukashenko thinks Putin is a bit of a loser with all of that stuff. That stuff's just froth atop a glass, not to be taken seriously, but for Putin it is serious. Whereas Putin, being earnest about all of this, thinks that Lukashenko is a clown, because Lukashenko is just a disgraceful narcissist. Lukashenko is very prone to Trump-like statements of, I'm a great historian, nobody does this better than me, nobody does that better than me, nobody stands up better than me, nobody has breakfast better than me, nobody knows about geography more than I do. So he says that quite a bit. Steph's is saying Putin has charisma. So what's weird is that Putin doesn't look like he has any charisma when you look at him outside the Russian context. In the context of knowing the language, he has no charisma, but a lot of formidableness, I would say. That's what I would say. You can be uncharismatic by formidable. Alex, lovely to see you too. Are Chinese plans disturbed by Putin? Well, it simply depends on what happens in the war. If Putin gets quite a good outcome for him in the war, that's beneficial to China. Ferrari guys, hi Ferrari guy, by the way, good to see you. If not Putin, who is a common question to which Russians don't give an answer on channels like 1420. Yeah, that's because there is a complete collapse of normative thoughts in Russia. They cannot imagine any alternative. And of course, it's also the wrong way to think about it. Who instead of Putin? It's not that there's a lack of people instead of Putin. It's that you need the circumstances to change. There'll be an endless supply of people who would be there instead of Putin. So it's kind of the wrong question under current conditions anyway, but it's also an expression of this extraordinary normative collapse. Rokas is asking how I see the potential challenge to Article 5 playing out, and I don't think I have that answer. I don't have the details for it. But the cartoonish picture is, let's create a situation where we have, a United States that's clearly going to have to say no to defending some kind of village in Estonia. I'm not literally saying that, right? I'm not saying Estonia is the most likely country to get invaded. I'm just saying that's the cartoonish scenario and the trend which we're likely to skip, but toward which we're still moving. Les, Merry Christmas, and thank you for the helpful wishes. We'll go 10 more minutes. What role does your YouTube channel play in your mental health? I'm amazed at why in your dark times you can maintain this connection. Because I am a philosopher, or as I said once in my very first year at the university when I fell off a balcony, drunk, and climbed into the window of people living on the ground floor, and they asked me what I did. I said I was a philosopher. So as a philosopher, my intellectual life is off YouTube in the sense that I don't have thoughts to share them on YouTube. I just have thoughts. So that helps me be grounded in the algorithm. Also, just checking the sound is still working. Also, um, I have these two hats. I'm trying to do a little bit of philosophical work, which is completely ground to a halt in the last few months because of my health crisis. I'm just sort of in these sort of tiny moments of sunlight, boom, straight away jumping to do the public intellectual conversation with you whenever I get a moment in midst the health turmoil. So these are the two hats I have on. I love them very much, and I don't understand these hats as tied to particular projects or to particular platforms. I love that these are two different hats, but they also are connected, right? A lot of what I have to give as a public intellectual is connected to what I don't say but do as a philosopher. That I might share, hopefully with the culture a bit later. So these are just two things I love very, very much, and that come naturally to me in a kind of physical way. So they're not a challenge. My challenge with YouTube right now is that it's a joy for which I have almost no capacity and no time at all, because I'm not given enough time that's free of physical suffering. That's a level of freedom from physical suffering that's commensurate with sharing with you is just not given to me enough. Um, so that's my only complaint in terms of when I do have the opportunity to do it. I'm in love. Also, we're a very positive community, and I have great empathy for people who send in sort of abuse, very rarely threats. Um, it can be frustrating that I'm not doing all the things that I would do to grow my channels. Um, if I just wanted to grow rather than share responsibly. So it's frustrating because you want, for an important message, a bigger platform, right? But to get to a bigger platform, you don't want to make videos about how Russia is going to collapse economically on Tuesday, right? So that's always a balance. But I'm not 12. I can deal with that balance. So it's just an incredibly positive and magical activity for me. This, and one of the things that I'm grateful, or if I may even say proud about myself, is that when I'm profoundly ill, I have the capacity to grow and explore. Like, even in this conversation, I'm struggling with lots of symptoms. I'm trying to focus on the screen. Lots of weird things are going on in my body. But I'm still able to be present with you to such a degree that I'm growing. I'm improving always as a mind of public intellectual. So for me, this is always a cause of growth, exploration, and it's immensely fulfilling always for human beings when they're doing something they love very much, where they have a big contribution to make, where they're also able to always evolve and get better. So it's incredibly beautiful, and you know it's fascinating. Some of you have been with me for a long time, whether you think I'm improving, because I think that I am. Somebody felt I was making a mild smiling tease of Joe Blogs on the Russian economic collapse. Sure, I don't actually watch the videos, but I actually took an important stance of support of his channel recently because he'd been hacked again, and it was absolutely outrageous if he wasn't going to get his channel back. And I just feel deeply that unbelievable uncertainty that he went through. So I'm extremely grateful that he's had his channel returned to him. So we feel this incredible collegiate solidarity, of course, on this platform. So I'm absolutely delighted um, to have him back on his main channel. Five more minutes. Let's see what we've got. I'm sorry I'm missing some questions, but let's see what we've got. Do I think there'll be an independent media backlash? Yeah, there's already one. For example, uh, progressive left YouTuber Kalkulinski is on a rampage criticizing independent media. I mean, he's been on a rampage criticizing Joe Rogan recently. Um, I mean, there is so much wrong with mainstream media, so much wrong with it. As I say, a lot of it is stuck in a kind of terrifyingly deluded obsession with a politics that is no longer not just good, but no longer even available to us. So mainstream media is a calamity much of the time, but alternative independent media is much worse. It's a much bigger epistemic hellhole. So that's the problem. We've got a collapse of institutional media, collapse of values, collapse of seriousness, collapse of quality. And then here comes independent media to substitute for that collapse, to make up for that collapse. And what it's offering is way worse and way more irresponsible. Um, so I do think there's already a huge backlash against it. And what there is, however, is deep love for the few, um, independent media platforms, whether they're single person or not, that are doing a profoundly responsible job. And I think there's a very deep love for those. However, I don't think you can have non-institutionalized journalism. Journalism, especially if we talk about sort of daily political coverage, is a profession that requires institutions. A world where there are 77 independent journalists working alone is a world without journalism in it. Might be a world with journalists in it, but it's a world without journalism. So certain things just need institutions. So it's not even conceivable to say that independent media could replace mainstream media. Doesn't work like that. But having said this, I mean, look, especially those of you who've been with me for a long time, and I'm not a journalist, I don't report on anything ever. I just analyze what is already reported upon and what very often I don't even need to describe because you already know it. But a lot of you find the connection you have with me magical because not you agree with something I've said or don't agree with something I've said, but because you find the degree of intentionality with which I approach putting something into your tummy profoundly moving. Now that's probably a minority of people in the community. That's too esoteric a reaction, but there's a few of you who feel that. Um, so um, you know, there we go. Um, so it's very independent media is a mixed story. We had some great questions today about how to make independent media less bad, but at the moment, independent media is a calamity, and it's losing very very badly. Um, Rachel says that Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian are destroying their media empire from the inside out. Now, I haven't watched TYT in several years, so I can't support I can't support or refute that statement. Um, but the crisis of um, independent media is big, And luckily, we are beginning to have a more constructive public conversation about it, as opposed to just gaslighting ourselves that some kind of constellation of claims assembled by an algorithm is good, independent media. And then there is something else I would add, that quite frankly, when it comes to the kind of bigger picture analysis that I offer, in the end, I do like the idea of borrowing standards of truth and seriousness from the academy and sticking by them, leaning on them, even in the public communication we do. And that often means that you sound ridiculous because you say, well, I can't speak about that, I can't talk about this. You often sound ridiculous because you end up saying, well, this is quite complex, and we need to consider 7 different dimensions here, and that doesn't sound catchy, doesn't sound attractive. But there's something powerful about that, and I use that academic epistemic grounding not just as a standard, but as a symbol, which is why it's so much more important to me that we have spaces online where people are repeatedly gathering to engage in the conversation, to engage in the dialogue within certain constraints, but also in a free way. That's more important to me. That process is more important for me. That kind of epistemic culturing is more important for me than, yeah, man, there is that view, but I'm going to make the argument why it's wrong, or I'm going to make the argument why it's right. And so we'll try to persuade ourselves of it. Much more importantly to me is the idea that we're engaged in some kind of a minor, modest, but shared enterprise of talking to each other about the world. That's much more important, and how we do that is much more important than whether 20% or 80% of you agree with some kind of view I've expressed. I mean, that's so secondary to me. And I think it's very healthy to have the priorities that way around. Because also something else, that's the last comment I'll make, that's a very big feature of the online culture, is the debate. Is the West in decline? 2 Rickies are saying that it is, and another 2 Rickies are saying that it isn't. Can physics explain morality? For and against. And I think that there's also something unhealthy about this culture of debate, because it too inspires us to operate in slogans and to try to win and mock rather than explore. And just one final remark, one of the other bad things online is when content creators rant. Like this one has been for the last 10, 15 minutes. I have no idea how 700 of you are tolerating that. But obviously, gratitude, and you deserve a special award for this. Now, we have not had a mic failure, which is the most interesting thing about our chat. And we are still the beautiful community. And we will speak to each other soon as the festive period approaches us. So thank you so much for being with me. Thank you, everybody. And we shall talk soon. Thank you so much, Amalfitano. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you so much, everybody. Patricia, thank you. Henrik, thank you. Stephs, thank you. Gunnar, thank you. Russell, thank you. David, thank you. Bye, 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 bye.